Hola amigos, bien o no, y saludos desde Inglaterra. Hoy el tema es escuchar y cómo escuchar para mejorar nuestra fluidez y también para mostrarle cómo yo preparar para leer en voz alta para mejorar mi fluidez también. Ese es el tema de hoy. Yo voy a compartir algo con este libro para mostrar. So, hello again from England. Today I'm going to talk about what to listen for, because listening is very important to help us improve our fluency in English, because by listening we hear a good example of how the language sounds, because unlike perhaps in Spanish where the spelling is our clue to the sound because it's spelled in a nice phonetic way and it's easy to see as you read it how it should sound. The spelling in English, as we know, is not standard in that way. There are lots of exceptions, things that really we just have to learn by experience, hence why the listening comes in. We learn by experience that in that case, that spelling, although it looks like you should say this, you actually say that. Yeah. So, to illustrate why listening then is very important, I'm going to show you by actually reading something. And I'm also going to explain to you how I prepare to do the reading, what I'm looking for, and why that changes the way it sounds. So, I've just picked from this book, because it's the nearest one to hand. I'm going to read a very short paragraph from it. So one of the things to listen for when you're listening to people speaking, or when they're reading, or over there you hear them speaking, is to listen for, in their intonation in English, which words they're putting more emphasis on, where are they pausing. Because by doing this, they're showing you the more important points of that sentence. They're trying to show you, consciously or not, they're trying to show you what words you should be listening for. So, in order to improve your fluency, the thing we're trying to really aim for is to be able to read with a similar pattern of intonation as native speakers. Because then your sound, not your accent, but your sound will be the same. So how do we do it? How do we, as native speakers, read with correct intonation and expression? How do we do it? Well, all right, look, I take a general paragraph at random from this book. I'm going to read this one here at the beginning. How do I prepare to read it? Well, first thing I do, I have a quick look at the paragraph, and I'm looking to see perhaps some of the punctuation, and I'm going to get a quick skim read through this, just mentally, to look at what it's about and some of the themes within it. Maybe I might spot within this a difficult word or phrase I'm going to have to think about, but generally I'm going to look at the punctuation and see if I can gauge from this some of the key words, because this is going to change the way that I would read it. If I just read it just word by word, rather in a way perhaps someone who's just learning to read would read it, then there is no expression. It's just I'm reading word by word. I'm not using the punctuation. I'm just reading it word by word. And this is where we get that very flat kind of monotone expression, which unfortunately some people tend to take into their adult life when they're reading. And then, of course, when they give speeches or presentations, everyone falls asleep because you get that kind of robot voice, which would be something like, to varying degrees we take charge of our lives. Through controlling our actions by our own plans, we become active rather than passive. We may hardly notice changes taking place in ourselves through being absorbed in what we are doing. So that's all the words said as you say them, but without any sense of expression and no focus on which are the more important ones within the sentence. Now, if I look back at those two sentences, I can see some punctuation in that. I can also spot some patterns in like word groups that we usually use together, and then we have some linking words and then some other word groups. And this helps me to see where we have a change in intonation. So we would get something like this. To varying degrees, we take charge of our lives. Through controlling our actions by our own plans, we become active rather than passive. We hardly notice changes taking place in ourselves through being absorbed in what we are doing. Sounds different, yeah? That's the same words, but different intonation. So this is why listening is very, very important, because the more you listen to the language, you start to notice this general intonation pattern. So when you read or when you start speaking and you're doing it too flat, you should notice the difference, because now you've got a reference of, no, the language normally sounds more like this. So at the beginning, listening is really important, because that helps us see the general sound of the language and why it might sound a bit different to your own native language, at least at the beginning. So then when you're reading, you have a reference in your mind that helps you get closer to that intonation when you're reading the new language. Yeah? Obviously, when you use the two together, when you have an example of someone reading it, and then you can go back and look at the text and see where they're putting their intonation, why this word is more important, obviously that's even more helpful. But at the beginning, it's listening to that type of intonation and using that as your guide to help you when you're reading to see whether you're reading it too flat, or are you also using a better type of intonation. So there are some other things to look at in the sentence, really. Sometimes we will stress opposites. So to become active rather than passive. So active and passive are the opposites. So I stress them. We become active rather than passive. Negatives are another one. You can stress in that sense. So it's not this, it's this. Because again, it's like an opposite. We use the commas to add a pause. Through controlling our actions by our own plans, there's a comma, so I pause, we become active rather than passive. So I then influence the opposites. So think of your listening as a guide to that. It helps you get a sense of the intonation pattern we generally use, and that's why English sounds different, let's say, to French or Spanish. Because the intonation pattern is slightly different, because the words are put together in a different way to make the same sentence. So if you translated this sentence back into Spanish, for instance, you would probably put slightly different intonation stress, because the key words appear in a different place in the sentence than they do in the English sentence, because the words are in a different order. That's the thing to listen for. So I'll read the rest of the paragraph so you have more of a reference. But again, in this, think about where am I pausing and what words am I putting more emphasis on? Because the words I emphasize slightly are the more important ones in the sentence. Have a listen. To varying degrees, we take charge of our lives. Through controlling our actions by our own plans, we become active rather than passive. We may hardly notice changes taking place in ourselves through being absorbed in what we are doing. But sometimes, we are more self-conscious. And this starts to change us. We form pictures of the sort of person we want to be. Someone may want to be braver, more tolerant, more independent, or less lazy. Consciously shaping our own characteristics is self-creation. There we are. So I hope you can see in that short example how the voice moves a little bit more intonation with it, some focus on more the key words and less on the others. But that's really where the listening comes into it, because once you get used to the sound of the language, you should be able to help tune the way that your own reading, because you start to get a sense of that's the general sound I'm aiming for. And then by listening to examples of particular text, where you have the text that you can read along while you're listening, you can really start to look for those patterns of where we put emphasis, where we pause, where we have those points of silence. So remember that. Listening, really, really important. So I'll leave you with that thought. Déjame saber en los comentarios, como siempre. I hope this one's been very useful to you. But for now, we'll say cheerio.